What's up, guys? Welcome back to Taking the Field with Stevie Mack, and on this episode, we're going to talk a lot about the Week 1 performances put up by the New York Atlas, going 2-0 on the weekend. First team in the season to go 2-0. They are atop the PLL standings as they hosted in Albany in Week 1. Not ready to start planning the parade in Albany in mid-September just yet, but we will talk a lot about them here momentarily in segment 1. I also want to revisit real quick before we jump into this episode, last week's episode, going back to the picks segment that we ended last week's show with. One thing that I left out accidentally from that episode was one of the preseason bets in an article by Hutton Jackson, where he talks about the Cannons and puts a futures bet on them to win the PLL championship in 2024. Their odds after Week 1, after they lost to the Atlas, they are now the third best odds on DraftKings to win the championship. The first team now after Week 1 is the Atlas because of that 2-0 start that they jumped out to, looking red hot to begin the season, especially offensively. Again, we're going to talk a lot about them here in segment 1 in just a moment. That first audio you heard, if you're listening to the show anywhere you get your podcasts, including iHeartRadio, TuneIn, Apple, and Spotify, also the Odyssey app as well. That's Audacy, the Odyssey app as well for the audio version of the show. Otherwise, if you're watching this on YouTube as well. But that first audio you heard on those audio channels was Atlas midfielder Miles Jones on the Atlas's offense to begin the season. At one point in that post-game interview said that it's probably the best team he's played on and probably the most fun that he's had in his pro career to date. So that was some really positive things to hear from one of the veterans of that team. Miles Jones it is now 31 years old, one of the older members of the Atlas team up there with Eric Law, who I believe, if I remember correctly, is now 33 years old. So again, Miles Jones, that first bit of audio that you heard. Second couple of pieces of audio were of Atlas head coach Mike Pressler talking in that first piece about the difficulties of playing the back-to-back games this weekend, but thought that his guys handled it very well, obviously coming away with those 2 wins. But again, just talking about how difficult it was for them to pull off such a feat. And then that second piece of audio from Coach Pressler was him talking about figuring out their 32-second offense, which I think it's safe to say after those first 2 games, they absolutely have found the right recipe to maximizing their 32-second offense. That's something that I know last season I talked a lot about with this Atlas team, was just that they never seemed like they found a solution to that 32-second offense, but this season it really feels like they've found that sort of, as I kind of put it a moment ago, that sort of winning recipe, that winning formula, kind of putting guys in the right places to really maximize that 32-second shot clock. And then that final audio was of Waterdogs coach Tierney on the decision, kind of on the flip side to the Atlas, the decision not to go with a face-off guy in Week 1, and really says after that clip, kind of finishing his comments, really says that he felt like not doing so didn't really impact the game in a major way because they only lost by the 1 goal, and they had numerous chances in the final 3.5 minutes of that game to tie or take the lead. And that's something that we're going to talk about later on in segment 2 of the show. But to get into now this episode. Segment 1, like I said, I really want to hit on the week 1 performance of the New York Atlas, getting those 2 wins on the weekend. The 32-second offense, I think it's safe to say, was absolutely on fire, and it was because of a lot of new and one maybe not new face, but they didn't have him last season, so kind of a new face to the offense this year. But it was a lot of some of the newer pieces that they've brought in offensively that were a big reason why the offense was as lethal as it was. You talk about guys like Schellenberger, Reed Bowring, Ronan Jacoby, and the kind of guy that I said was new but not really new, being Dox Aiken, because they didn't have him last season. He's back now with the team this year. All those guys contributed in major ways, in some way, shape, or form, to their performance this weekend. So that was really big for them, proving that Coach Pressler went out this offseason and made some of those moves, bringing in these guys, again, drafting a guy like Schellenberger, bringing in Bowring and Ronan Jacoby, and getting Dox Aiken to come back and be part of this year's Atlas team. But again, just seeing what those guys were able to bring to the table this weekend was really cool, and hopefully if you're the Atlas, that's something that they can continue to do for weeks to come. And I really liked, at least in the Cannons game, I didn't watch for it so much during the Whipsnakes game, but during the Cannons game on Saturday afternoon, I really liked the strategy that they deployed on faceoffs, where they had 2 shorties on the wing on the faceoffs, basically just playing it as if they knew they were going to win the faceoff, because the Cannons didn't have a faceoff specialist going against Trevor Baptiste. So they were basically playing it as if they knew they were going to win it, and that's where you saw guys like Reed Bowring, Ronan Jacoby, Dox Aikens, the list goes on and on. That's where those guys really kind of shined in that 32-second offense, was because you were able to put 2 shorties on the wing like that. And then at one point they also had guys like Brian Costabile down on the defensive half of the field, so that when Baptiste wins it back to himself, he flips it over to the shorty that's buried down there. Baptiste goes off, Mitty carries it over, right? And then they probably brought that other long pole on behind the play. So again, just kind of the nuance of what they were doing with it, especially against the Cannons. Like I said, I didn't watch for it specifically against the Whipsnakes, but at least what they did against the Cannons I thought was very solid in the way that they executed it. It was something that really I thought they could have done last year, but I think when I thought about this before recording this episode, I think what it was is it kind of goes back to what I said before about having guys like Schellenberger, Bowring, Ronan Jacoby, guys like that they didn't necessarily have last year, or if they did, it was maybe for a game or two at the very end of the season when, you know, their season had already kind of been written at that point. But I think it was maybe kind of just the fact that they didn't have guys like that last year, to where they couldn't necessarily, they didn't have the personnel to be able to do those kinds of things. Now they do, and that's why they kind of went in that direction. And I think listening to Coach Pressler's comments in the post-game interview, I think at one point in time during that interview, he even kind of alludes to that as well, and basically says, we went into this offseason knowing that that's kind of the direction we wanted to go with it, so we needed guys that we knew could execute that game plan, and that's what we did. We brought these guys in, they executed it, and we won 2 games. I mean, it was literally that simple, I think, for the Atlas. And I think what it did for them was it allowed them to get in the flow of their offense a lot faster, because you saw it against the Cannons. They scored twice in the first minute of the game. Against the Whipsnakes, I think they were up something like 6-1 at the end of the first quarter. So because they were able to settle into their offense a lot quicker, they were able to get looks a lot quicker, they were able to then score a lot quicker, and that's something that last season they really struggled with in that 32-second offense, was they were getting into their offense with 8, 10, 12 seconds to go on the shot clock. This weekend, they were getting into it with 20, 22, 24 seconds, even a couple times they were letting go of shots. So just a lot quicker on offense, making decisions a lot quicker, and it certainly helps when you've got guys like Jeff Teague, Schellenberger, guys like that can make those decisions in real time as quickly as they were. And then speaking of Jeff Teague, I mean, just an absolutely unreal weekend from him. Had 18 points overall on the weekend, going for 7 goals and 11 assists. Just again, an unreal weekend for him. And Schellenberger as well, in the one game that he played, had a ridiculous pro debut. Had, I believe it was 8 points in his debut on Saturday afternoon. And then taking a look at the defense was something that I really wanted to see kind of with the 32-second offense. The defense I needed to see drastic improvement from what we saw last year, and I even said it on last week's episode. Just even if you can get the occasional stop on defense, I think you're going to put yourself in a better position this season, and they did just that. And even more so, really. I mean, there was times where they were just locking the other team's offense down at times, and I'll get to that in just a second. But they got the stops, and Troutner goes 58% for the weekend, which I think more often than not is definitely going to get the job done. I know a lot of people were disappointed that we didn't get to see Liam Entenmann in the goal this weekend, but when Troutner's going 58% like that, and you're holding the Cannons to 12 goals, and for most of the game against the Whipsnakes, you were holding them down pretty well. You know, I get it. People want to see him. He was the 5th overall pick, but Troutner did the job, and he was a big reason you went 2-0, so I can't really be mad about it. But the job that Adler did this weekend against Nolting and Zed Williams was fantastic, I think, because I saw somebody tweeted this out after their game against the Whipsnakes the other day, but they said that Adler held those two guys in that matchup this weekend, held them to 5 combined points over those 2 games. And another guy that I thought really stepped up well for them defensively was Carpenter, their 4th round pick. He really was somebody that I thought showed up quite a few times in the game against the Whipsnakes, and really made an impact on the defensive end in that game. And then Kobe Smith, they get him back healthy from day one this year. Last year missed a lot of time with an injury, and again, that's something that Coach Pressler talked about in his post-game comments, but Kobe Smith made an impact on the defensive end as well in week 1, had a couple caused turnovers, 3 ground balls, and also hit a 2-pointer on the weekend as well. So a lot of guys defensively, Troutner being one, talked about Adler, Carpenter, Kobe Smith. A lot of those guys made huge impacts on the defensive side of things and really impacted those games to lead to wins for the Atlas. One thing I will say, though, one kind of negative that I took from their performance this weekend is the transition defense still does need to be addressed and still needs to be worked on. And I think that's ultimately what allowed the Cannons and the Whipsnakes really to hang around in those games. I know the Whipsnakes hit a couple 2s in the game against the Atlas. That really helped their cause a little bit. Cannons, same thing. A lot of their goals out of the 12 they had, probably 3, 4, maybe 5 of those were in transition. So I think the Atlas, their one thing that they got to take away from this weekend that they still need to work on is that transition defense. But I think overall you really have to give Pressler a lot of credit because his draft picks are panning out. Makar and Adler had pretty big weekends this weekend. Obviously, a guy like Schellenberger had a pretty solid weekend himself in the one game that he played. Carpenter, I mentioned, really showed up in the Whipsnakes game, right? So a lot of these different draft picks that he's had since he's been with the Atlas are starting to make big impacts on this team, and that was obviously his hope from the beginning when he drafted these guys, but now to see it kind of playing out in real time on the field is really cool to see for the New York Atlas. But you also have to give credit to guys that I kind of mentioned at the top of this segment, guys like Jacoby and Bowring, who have also been really solid additions for them so far. And I guess my final thoughts with this segment, kind of to put a bow on it for the Atlas in week 1, is that when this offense is on, I know there's going to be stretches of games where it's not. I know that there's going to be maybe a weekend in particular where maybe the shots just aren't going for them or whatever the case may be. But when this offense is on, they are almost impossible to stop. And they showed you that this weekend. Jeff Teat showed you that this is his offense and it's going to revolve around him, but not in a selfish way. It's going to be a just get me the ball and let me find guys where they're going to be in a position to make plays. And that's exactly what he did. So again, I think when they're right, this offense is going to be almost impossible to stop. The defense does, as I just mentioned, need to get more organized, I think, and communicate better with their transition defense. But it is still a pretty young defense when you think about it. Like, I think Rexroad is 25, 26 years old, and then you look at guys like Adler and Makar are, 23, 24 years old. So that's a very young defense that they're playing with right now. I think that as the season goes along and they continue to build that chemistry, those things will be addressed and they will be fixed as the season goes along. And then really you look at it, at the top of this roster in terms of age, you've got guys like Eric Law, Miles Jones, Troutner, Jeff Teat is, I believe I saw on the roster, it said he's 27 now. So you got some of these guys, but I mean, really outside of them, Baptiste is another one. I believe it said is 27, but really outside of that, I just kind of mentioned it. You look at guys like Aiken and Costabile are 26, Xander Dixon's 25, Makar's 23. I mean, there's a lot of young players on this Atlas roster. So I think that with the way they're built right now, this is one of those things where they're kind of built to last if they can get this thing right and they can keep putting the ball in the back of the net like they were doing this weekend. Again, if they can fix the transition defense a bit and Troutner keeps playing at a high level, this is a team that I think is built for not just this year, but for the next few years to come because of the youth that they have within them. So coming up in segment 2, like I said, kind of putting a bow on the Atlas's week 1 performance. Segment 2, I want to get into the Archers and Waterdogs game that kind of led off the weekend. I have a few thoughts on that, specifically with the last few minutes of that game. But this is Taking the Field with Stevie Mack. All right, welcome back. Taking the Field with Stevie Mack. Segment 2 of the show. Segment 1, we did a deep dive into the New York Atlas as they rolled to 2 wins in week 1 on their home field up in Albany. Segment 2, as I mentioned before the break, I want to get into the Archers and Waterdogs game from week 1 because the last few minutes really puzzled me, is a good way that I would put it, because especially for how things ended in that game for the Waterdogs as the Archers got the 1-goal win. The last few possessions for the Waterdogs kind of puzzled me a little bit, so I want to talk about that here. And I'd love to get your thoughts on this discussion. But with less than about 3, maybe 3.5 minutes to go in the game, the Waterdogs had it on the end line out of a timeout because of a review. They were reviewing a shot by the Archers at the other end of the field. They wanted to see if it went in. It didn't, so the Waterdogs had it right around the end line behind their offensive cage as they were looking to try and tie the game up. At that point, it was 12-11 in the late stages of the game. So again, they had the possession right along the end line, and basically immediately, like right on the whistle, they turn it over on the end line. And so they lose out on that possession, again, coming essentially out of a timeout. So you'd like to have seen them be a little more alert, I guess, on the whistle, be a little more organized than what they were, as that was a immediate turnover. Then a few possessions later, maybe it was their ensuing possession on offense, they called a timeout to try and draw up a play, and they ran the backside seal play for Kieran McCardle, who in last week's episode, the preview to week 1 episode, I actually had him as one of my bets to go over 3.5 points. He unfortunately finished the game with 2 points. He had a goal and assist, and he really offensively had a quiet day. I think by his standards, just 1 of 9 shooting. And that's kind of what confused me about that play, is that they ran it for McCardle, who, as I just said, was 1 for 9 shooting on the day. And he takes the shot off that little seal pick on the left wing, and the defender's basically like maybe within 4 yards of him when he takes the shot. So it, of course, gets blocked and it rolls out near midfield. And I feel like in that instance, I would have liked to have seen him maybe make that pass through X to Sowers. Maybe he tries to push it above goal line and try to make something happen above the cage, or maybe try to move it back to the opposite wing and see if they couldn't get something on the opposite wing after that initial look didn't work. But they take the shot there, it doesn't work out. And like I said, I would have just liked to have maybe seen them make the extra pass in that situation. And then at the end, the Waterdogs, still trailing by 1, go on a man up with, I think, somewhere around maybe 45 seconds left in regulation. And their first look on the man up was a 2-pointer. And this is where I got kind of really confused, because I didn't love initially the idea of taking that 2 there, because it really felt like they settled for that look. Again, you're only down 1, and Dobson had made probably about 19 saves to that point, because in the final 5 seconds or so, he makes 2 or 3 saves right at the buzzer. So I think at that point he had 19, maybe 20 saves at that point. So it kind of felt like taking the 2 there felt like you were settling a bit. But I think if you wanted to play devil's advocate with it a bit, you could say that maybe they felt like they needed the 2 there because they weren't going to get the face-off in overtime against Sisselberger. So essentially they were trying to put the game in their own hands, put the game in their control, and say, hey, we're either going to win it or lose it essentially on this one shot. We're going to take our chance at the 2 and then kind of live with whatever the result was. Obviously, we know what the result was of that decision. And then, like I said, in the final 5-10 seconds or so, they did get one final push at it before the buzzer. They got 2 shots off on Cage, nothing doing against Dobson, and the Archers come away with that 12-11 win. So like I said at the top of segment 2, I kind of wanted to get your thoughts on sort of the final 3.5 minutes of the game for the Waterdogs and some of the decision making that they had offensively as they were trying to really crack the code that was Brett Dobson in the cage, trying to tie that game up, what would have been tying it up at 12, and they were unsuccessful in their efforts. So again, let me know your thoughts on those final few possessions as I just gave you the rundown on that, because like I said, the way I would describe it is it was puzzling, because the one possession you turn it over immediately off the whistle, next possession you draw up a play for a guy that went 1 for 9 shooting, and then essentially your final possession, because I wouldn't really count that scramble at the end, but then essentially your final real possession, you go man up, and again, it kind of felt like they settled for the 2. Final segment of the show here, taking the field with Stevie Mack, recapping week 1 in PLL action. Final segment coming up. We'll get to a few of your thoughts next. All right, welcome back in. Final segment of the show here, taking the field with Stevie Mack, whether you're watching on YouTube or listening to the audio, wherever you get your podcasts again, Apple, Spotify, iHeartRadio, TuneIn, and the Odyssey app as well, AUDACY, the Odyssey app for the audio versions of the show. One thing I missed at the end of segment 2 that I want to circle back to just to kind of wrap up that discussion is we spent the segment talking about the Waterdogs and kind of how they played out those last 3.5 minutes of that game. But I kind of want to flip it here real quick before we get into some of your thoughts to round things out. I want to flip it real quick on the Archers for the last 20 minutes and change of that game, because I mean, what was that? I mean, the last 20 minutes of the game, they didn't score a goal. You were up 9-4 at the half. You scored a 2 coming out of halftime, then followed that up with a one-pointer from Eamon. I believe he actually assisted on the two-pointer prior to that as well, and then essentially just shut it down for the final 20 minutes and change. But you also have to give credit to the Waterdogs defense that finally showed up around the 8:23 mark of the third quarter as well, because that was the last time that the Archers would score in that game. So also shout out to Dylan Ward and the Waterdogs defense for actually making an effort after the 8:23 mark of the third quarter and helping their team kind of scratch and claw their way back in it. But again, the Archers just kind of went into a shell at that point. You know, those last 20-ish minutes of that game really felt like their offense just kind of shut it down, packed it in, and was just trying to get to triple zeros on the game clock. And luckily for them, they have Dobson in the cage, and he was able to slam the door on some of those Waterdogs chances that we talked about in segment 2. But again, that's kind of how I wanted to flip it and get to the Archers there. So I wanted to circle back to that. But getting to your thoughts to finish out the episode from an Atlas fan on the PLL Discord group. He says, Troutner was good. Will Ettenman ever play? How will Captain Eric Law fit into a red-hot attack of Shelley, Dixon, Teat, and Malloy, who all played really well? Respect for Pressler making smart off-season moves and draft. And he also had a couple other comments as well. I kind of cherry-picked these in particular, so kind of just to go one by one here quickly with these comments. Troutner was good. Yeah, we talked about him and the defense as a whole in segment 1 with that Atlas discussion. If you want to go back, listen to any of that, just hit the rewind button wherever you're watching or listening to the show on. We kind of ran down the list of those platforms momentarily. But yeah, we talked about him back in segment 1, went 58% on the weekend in saves, and I think that's a big reason why we didn't see Liam Ettenman, but you also have to figure he didn't really get any training camp time because he was a little busy winning a national championship, and he, I think, didn't even show up until maybe Thursday or Friday when they went to practice before their first game against the Cannons. So you have to figure, I don't think the game plan was essentially to just throw him out there with little to no practice time and just kind of hope for the best. I wouldn't be surprised if at some point in time they do give him a spot start here and there just to give Troutner a break. But it's hard for me to rationalize a guy getting you 2 wins in one weekend in a span of 24 hours. He goes almost 60% in such games, and then you just want to immediately hand the keys over to a rookie who has barely even had one practice in his pro career. Now, that's no knock against Ettenman. I'm not against them giving him an opportunity. I definitely welcome it at some point in this summer. I'm just saying it doesn't necessarily have to be at this very moment in time as we're staring down week 2 in the regular season. As far as his comments about Eric Law, yeah, Eric Law, I believe, was put on the physically unable to perform list earlier today on Monday afternoon. So he's going to be out for at least a couple games with that. So I think you're going to see a steady dose of Schellenberger, Dixon, Teat, and Malloy. Excuse me. Now, which 3 of them they go with? Is there a scenario where maybe they can run all 4? Maybe Malloy comes out of the box or something. So I definitely think it'll be interesting in the weeks to come with Law being unavailable to them, how they're going to play that attack unit, because as this person says, all 4 of them were very highly productive players for them on offense this weekend. So essentially it's a good problem to have, because you can now say, okay, we can either take just 3 of them or we can take all 4 and kind of figure out how we're going to plug and play them when we get to wherever the next PLL weekend is going to be at, right? So it's definitely a good problem to have. And then he says, respect for Pressler for making smart off-season moves and draft. And yeah, that's something that we kind of rounded out segment 1 with, was kind of giving Pressler his flowers for bringing in guys like Bowring and Ronan Jacoby and convincing Dox Aiken to come back and rejoin the Atlas this season and kind of doing the things that I think needed to be done this off season to better this team and kind of make the adjustments that pretty much anybody knew that they needed to make going into this season, i.e. the defense, i.e. the 32-second offense, and it's paid dividends from day one already. From Morg20 on PLL Discord, he says, hats off to the whole defense, again talking about the Atlas, hats off to the whole defense, held Nolting, Holman, Zed, and Rambo to 5 goals combined. And yeah, I mean, that is quite the statistic. That is definitely something that when you read that, you almost have to read it again and again just to make sure that you're comprehending what you're reading. Because again, I'll read the names. Nolting, Holman, Zed, and Rambo held to combined 5 goals by this Atlas defense. And yes, guys like Rexroad and Adler were big parts to that. Mentioned back in segment 1 that Adler was responsible for locking down Nolting and Zed Williams this weekend, and he did just that. So yeah, hats off to the entire Atlas defense, and hats off to Troutner, who had the big weekend himself, because they were a big part, along with the offense scoring, what was it, like 18 goals a game, something like that, along with the offense. But the defense definitely was not a liability in week 1 for the Atlas. That'll do it for this episode of Taking the Field with Stevie Mack. Make sure to like, comment, and share on this episode. Let me know what you guys think about the Atlas's week 1 performance. Going back to that discussion in segment 2 about the Waterdogs, let me know what you think about the way that they handled those last 3 or so possessions of that game offensively. And then as well, we welcome any comments or questions or anything that you might have regarding the PLL. But that'll do it for me. I'll talk to you guys later.